Hi, I'm Chris Colvin. I'm the founder of In the House. We're a community to empower in-house counsel through professional networking, educational opportunities, and thought leadership. This is the monthly meeting of our Privacy and Cybersecurity Working Group. I have my co-host here, David Heckler, and each month we get together to talk about issues that are relevant to in-house lawyers who are interested in cybersecurity. In my personal view, I think we all ought to be interested in cybersecurity because increasingly that's a part of our lives as lawyers. We play a critical role in educating our peers about the increasing number of regulations in this area, and also need to work closely with our colleagues on the tech side who are in charge of cybersecurity. Which leads us to our topic for today. We're really delighted to have a guest here who David will introduce and provide some more information, but basically an expert in the fast-growing field of autonomous vehicles. To me, the news that's been about Boeing and the problems with Boeing's onboard systems really helped elevate this issue for me as we prepared for today, because I think the original autonomous vehicles were airplanes, right? For decades, the airplanes have been largely self-piloted with only minimal intervention over the course of the trip by the pilots. And I think what Boeing brought home to me, and I think to others, is our lives are literally depending on this type of technology to work. And when we move into the autonomous vehicle era, which is coming, I think, quicker than any of us thought a few years ago, we need to multiply that issue times millions, right? Because there are a million cars for every airplane in the sky. And we're all going to be dependent, literally putting our lives into the hands of these vehicles. And I think that's exciting in terms of freeing up time to do things. I don't particularly enjoy driving, and if I could have a safe way of a machine driving for me, I'd be all for it. But it also opens up a lot of issues when it comes to cybersecurity. So without further ado, let me introduce David Heckler, my co-chair of this working group, and he will introduce you to our guest.
Thanks, Chris. Just a reminder to all of you who are joining us that we're recording this on a video, and if you don't want your picture, you want to ask a question, but you don't want your image to appear, you can cover your lens. If you don't want your name associated with anything, you don't have to mention your name. Without saying anything more about that, our guest today is Summer Fowler. She is a security chief at Argo AI, which is a startup, but an unusual one in that it received $1 billion, that's billion with a B, from Ford Motor Company to produce software for its autonomous vehicles. And the mandate that Argo AI has is that by the end of 2021, it will be ready to install the software to create fully autonomous vehicles. Summer will talk more about that later. Summer's got a broad background in this field. She was a computer science major and worked at a variety of companies. By the end of today, I believe, we will have the interview I did with her, the print interview I did with her, on the In the House website, on the page for Cybersecurity and Privacy Working Group, as well as either today or tomorrow, the video that we are now producing with Summer. But there's also another video. I did a quick 3-minute video with her a few days ago, which I asked her about communicating with the lawyers, but also, you know, there's an interesting connection between legal departments and tech companies, tech departments at companies. They're both viewed with some trepidation by colleagues. And without saying more, Summer's going to address that and how the two departments learn to work together. Roll the tape.
Give me just a second. There we go.
Welcome to the Nugget, where we offer in-house lawyers and those who work with them a few minutes of advice from cybersecurity experts. My name is David Heckler. I'm the editor-in-chief of CyberInsecurity News, and today our guest is Summer Fowler, who works as the Chief Security Officer at Argo AI. Welcome, Summer.
Thank you.
Argo AI is a software company that's working with Ford Motor Company to produce autonomous vehicles. Today, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk to Summer about something else, the office of no. I think you've heard that expression. It refers to, in some companies, the law department, because they are accused or thought to be obstructing business or complicating unnecessarily business initiatives. But I understand that it's also used about tech departments at companies because they are holding on to the data so securely that the business, the clients internally, or the outside experts who may be their vendors can't actually use the data for business purposes. So, Summer, I think you've heard this before. How do you handle the tension that arises when this crops up?
David, I've absolutely heard the office of no before. Another phrase I've heard is the office of business prevention. That's another one of my favorites. And so we have heard this in cybersecurity, and I understand that it can be very frustrating because engineers and other people inside the company have a job to do and a goal that they want to accomplish. And so when they hear that something that they want to do doesn't fit within the cybersecurity profile, it's extremely frustrating. So one of the things that I like to do right away is set up a meeting and put us on the same page in terms of that we each have the same goals. We do want to be able to produce the safest software that is out there in order, for our vehicles to become autonomous. And cybersecurity is a really critical part of that safety of an AV or autonomous vehicle. So I like to start from a position of mutual goal or mutual objective and work from there. And oftentimes that means that I need to find a creative solution for the engineers that will mean they can both meet their engineering objectives and stay within the cybersecurity profile or risk appetite of cybersecurity for the company. There are really specific techniques that I use, and I would love to talk to you about those when we next meet.
Thanks, Summer. I'm David Heckler, editor-in-chief of CyberInsecurity News, and we've had Summer Fowler from Argo AI. If you'd like to know more about what Summer had to say, you can read a lengthy interview with her on our website at www.cyberinsecuritynews.com. That's it for this installment of The Nugget. Thank you. So, there we go. Why don't you tell, Summer, our audience a little bit more about the company and your role there. And then we'll encourage them to make comments, ask questions. And for audience members, if you take your cursor and move it to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a little chat icon at the bottom. That's where, if you'd like to ask a question that way or make a comment that way, I'll be monitoring those chat comments. But we welcome your direct participation as well. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about Argo, and especially to start a dialogue with you. So as David said, please use the chat window, unmute, ask questions. I used to work at Carnegie Mellon University full-time. I still teach there. I teach both graduate students and executive education programs. And so I heavily rely on class participation. We were joking that you're all going to be graded when you come out of here today. So a big portion of your grade is going to be class participation. So we want to hear your questions and make this of benefit to you. So Argo AI, the AI stands for Artificial Intelligence, is a company that was started in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for a very specific reason, in that Pittsburgh is where Carnegie Mellon University is, and the founders both had very close ties to Pittsburgh itself, either through the University of Pittsburgh or through going to or working at Carnegie Mellon University and recognizing the level of talent that really comes out of the local schools. Both of our founders, Brian Selesky and Pete Rander, had worked together at Google, and had decided that they were ready to branch out on their own and focus entirely on the safety aspect of autonomous vehicles. Now, that's not to say that they're not looking at all of the functionality, but they wanted to make sure that the company that they started was a leader in this space. It's really important to note that we at Argo don't want to view safety as a differentiator or a competitive advantage. I mean, that would be relatively silly if Delta Airlines was saying, come fly on our planes because they're safer than American Airlines planes. That would be a very bizarre dynamic in the airline world. What we want to do is something similar in the autonomous vehicle space, where we are setting a really high standard that all of the other autonomous vehicle companies will rise to, so that the entire ecosystem is the safest that it can be for all passengers. And so we are very, very much focused on making sure that the products that we put out, the software that we build and put onto right now Ford vehicles, because they are our primary investor, that it's really safe and secure. And it is important to add that level of cybersecurity, because a critical element of any sort of connected device, as all of you know, is that we want to ensure that it cannot fail either from a failure in process or a mistake in the code and harm someone, or be maliciously overtaken by someone from the outside or even inside of the vehicle. And so my role, when I started here about 4 months ago as the Chief Security Officer, is to focus entirely on security of both our organizational infrastructure, so just the day-to-day operations, the business, the laptops that we use, our financial systems, the development environment, but also to focus on the safety and cybersecurity of the software that we put and the systems that we put onto the cars. And it's interesting because it feels like autonomy is so close and yet so very far away. And what I mean by that is I actually get into a car every 2 to 3 weeks. I drive around it in the back seat. All of our cars have 2 people in the front, 1 driver and 1 co-driver, it's called. The driver is there literally with his or her hands next to the wheel to take over on less than a second's notice. And there are lots of criteria for when to take over. In fact, we have some Formula One racers who have come and looked at our driving curriculum and said that they have never seen anything as rigorous, and the people coming out of this program could probably go drive Formula One because the driving program is so rigorous. So that driver is there, and then the co-driver is monitoring to make sure that the driver is staying on top of things and typing things in about the environment. So, is there a new stop sign that we're mapping, or has it overturned? Is there a curb that has shifted? I mean, there are so many different things. We want that person's also monitoring what the car is looking at, because we have lots of different sensors on the car that use light or radar or just vision, sound. And so that co-driver is monitoring all of those inputs and saying, oh, I see a cyclist. What is the car seeing right now? Or I see a cyclist at a 45-degree angle. Does the car recognize it as a bike with a rider on it? And so we get lots of information from that activity. We also have a very, very rigorous simulation environment with tens of thousands of scenarios that all of our software runs through. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, now I'm not only concerned with the software that we're running, but also the scenarios that we have built, and are those scenarios correct? And so one great thing about this is I will probably not be out of a job for a long time, at least in this type of role. And it's really exciting because there's so much new tech being built on a daily basis. And I see that when I get into that car every 2 to 3 weeks and drive around Pittsburgh, and the car is in autonomous mode most of the time. And so I get to see what updates we've made in the software, what the mapping looks like. And so in one regard, it feels like autonomy is so close, because I'm sitting in a car in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it's driving itself. And when we make a turn and there's a FedEx truck pulled over delivering packages, the car automatically shifts to the left lane and seamlessly moves around that FedEx truck. It's really incredible. On the other hand, we are still years and years away from real autonomy and being able to get the driver fully out of the car. And so our goal, as David mentioned, is by the end of 2021, potentially moving into 2022, we would like to be at what is called SAE level 4 autonomy. So that essentially, there are 5 levels. Nobody has really defined level 5 clearly, but level 4 is the first level where you don't have a need even for a steering wheel or pedals in a car. Now, that doesn't mean the cars won't have those, but you wouldn't have a need for that because there would be no driver there. So that's a little bit about Argo. You may have seen in the news, if you did any Googling, that we are looking for a second partnership. That's something that, even though the Wall Street Journal said that it was finalized, is not finalized yet. But that deal is in the works, which is really exciting because it would increase our footprint. It could also get us into the electric vehicle space, which is another very exciting aspect of this, because we don't just think about safety when we think about the impact of autonomous vehicles. We also think about the environmental impacts. And if we can, optimize driving, think of what we could then do in terms of, carbon emissions or time on the road. We also very much think about the socioeconomic impact. If we can do things like close the gap of that last mile between public transportation and where people need to be. There are, millions of people who don't have access to affordable transportation right now. And that is a big differentiator in future success for those people. If you have people who can't get to jobs or can't get to an educational institution to better themselves or educate themselves, you've really cut out a whole portion of potential workforce and society. And we want to have a positive impact and make some societal changes in that way as well. So lots of angles to address here. I'm excited to talk more, especially about how I work with the legal team and with the engineers, which can also, always be a delicate balance. But if you have any questions about Argo, AI, cybersecurity, my role, I'm happy to answer those, and we can get into some questions from David and Chris as well. Thank you.
Well, Summer, why don't you begin by, you created a little teaser in that video that I thought was quite effective. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the techniques that you found to be effective in bridging gaps in communication?
Yeah. So there are 2 really important things that I like to do when I'm working with engineers or anyone, and it's a negotiating technique, right? Instead of starting as the office of no, I want to start as the office of yes, but. Right. So and I get crazy requests. I know you all get these kinds of requests as well as attorneys, but I'll get requests to use software that was developed in a country that's, potentially, a country that would have, would want to steal our intellectual property. And the engineers are like, I really need to use this piece of software because it has code that will speed up my performance in a certain way. And, in one regard, I could just say, absolutely not. This is a no from the start. I don't, why would you even ask me this? And what I really need to do is start from a position of, okay, yes, I understand that you need to do X, Y, and Z. Now let's talk through the business requirements and the technical requirements for what you need to achieve. And so what I'm doing is educating myself by getting technical requirements from the engineers. And I'm also educating them by talking around the business requirements or the cybersecurity requirements. And we literally document this. It can slow things down. It does have the potential to slow things down in some ways, but it also we've gotten to a rhythm with some groups where they understand now if they want to ask for something, they need to come forward with those requirements. And then I have to get creative, and this is where I really have to lean on my team, and I have to do a lot of research, because now I have to find a solution or help them find a solution that works, that isn't coming from that country or doesn't have, software that has all of these vulnerabilities inside of it. So my first technique is absolutely to document what I call business requirements and to include the technical requirements inside of that. We've actually formalized a template. I didn't design it myself, but someone who does some of the writing for the IT team has formalized a BRD, or business requirements document. And so now everyone knows when they're working with cybersecurity or an IT team, we just need to pull that together. So it's a great way to get to a point of what are we actually trying to achieve, and let's problem solve together. From a specific cybersecurity standpoint, the second thing that I like to do as a very particular technique is to do a little bit of threat modeling. And I do this with even just the design of systems. But if someone makes a request, then as I work through the requirements with them, I ask us to work together to decide, okay, what are the potential threat vectors that could disrupt what it is that we're trying to achieve here? And through that process, I also try to educate the engineers or the financial team or the legal team who's asking for something to not just think about this is a need that I have, but also what are the exposures that it opens up for the company if we use this. If I'm looking at a piece of software and I know that it comes from a country that could potentially want to steal our IP, or I know that it's an open source piece of software, meaning that anybody in the world could have contributed to that code base. Or when I think about financial or legal standpoint, then we start to look at what is the risk of that company not being around in 6 months. And so we think about those threat vectors together, and that really starts to get to a point where either I'm convinced that, yes, the threat is not as big as I thought it was, or they're convinced, yeah, you're right, this is too big of a risk for the organization. So those are two really particular techniques that I use.
Well, if nobody else is going to jump in, I know you talk to lawyers a lot. First, you have internal lawyers at Argo. You have Ford lawyers you're dealing with. Then you have outside counsel.
Yes.
So that's quite a laundry list of individuals you're dealing with on legal teams. But I think you told me that you talk to lawyers pretty much every day.
Absolutely.
On something. So what are the occasions, and how do you manage that relationship in a way that ends up being productive for both sides?
So it is through a lot of the daily communications and getting into a rhythm with, in particular, the inside counsel, our in-house attorneys. I talk to them daily. We have different, meetings every week where we're working through several different types of activities, whether it's analyzing contracts that have, we're trying to open up, whether it's looking at a deal that we're trying to close with, potential investors. And one of the best things that I think has happened at Argo is having that daily interaction and making it so that we're actually a team together rather than a team against each other. I also very, very much value the inputs from the legal counsel to explain to me the risks from their side, right? So what is it that's important in protecting Argo's business angle? How can we work together? Like, one of the very first things that we worked on was something that we could do together, which was protection of our patents. So, when we put in for a patent, that information, those disclosures are part of our, bread and butter, the crown jewels of the company. So how are we ensuring that that we have a mutual objective and then the goals together on how we're going to achieve protection of those assets? And so that was a really nice way to get some inside scoop from them and to work together. And now it really feels like we're on a team together rather than on opposite sides of the ball field.
And I'll just add that you talked about how you have a cafeteria. You have it's sort of like the Silicon Valley model for everybody eats together for free, et cetera. And that just spawns conversations that can lead to more collaboration than you would have otherwise, perhaps.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, I feel like if we would make our government eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner with each other and start treating each other like humans, then maybe we could get somewhere in this country. And I kind of take that tactic when I'm at work as well, that, I try to sit down and eat with different teams, or, get to know them as people outside of work as well, because it's really easy to get angry with someone if you only think of them as, oh, that's just legal. But it's very different if you think of them as Laura, who has, a French bulldog that I heard about at lunch yesterday. Then it's a human element, right? And now I can negotiate and work with Laura, and I'm not just, throwing jabs at the legal team in the distance.
So
and this is our cybersecurity lunch, and I've got 2 questions in the chat. But Chris, do you want to say something before I get to them?
I wanted to pick up on a point that Summer just made, and that's about the interactions with the lawyers at your company. Lawyers, I guess, in the broader public, we don't have a very good reputation for being tech forward. We're more like viewed as technology followers, and that's sort of, I guess, an occupational hazard, since we depend on precedents from 50, 100 years ago sometimes. So what practical suggestions would you have for lawyers so that we can develop more skills and knowledge to interact better with you and your peers on the cybersecurity side? What can we do? What can the people on this call and other lawyers do to sort of breach that gap from our side a little better than we do now?
So depending on what your field is inside of the law, because that's like saying in medicine, and
right.
All these different forms of the legal profession, I would say to start looking at cybersecurity related case studies that are in your field, whether it's, in the patents or if it's in courtrooms. What are some of those case studies that have occurred? And then you can kind of dig into, oh, well, what does even that mean, right? So what is a distributed denial of service attack? And you can do a little bit more reading in that space. But it helps if it's really relevant to your field and you're not reading a technical journal. The other thing that is very helpful, follow some people and read some articles that are on LinkedIn and Twitter that are in the cybersecurity realm. So Krebs on Security, Krebs, is a really famous person that he sends out a lot of alerts on what's happening in security. But looking around and just doing a bunch of reading, and I know attorneys do a lot of reading all day long, but that can be very helpful. Looking for trends on Twitter to see what's happening in the world right now. And then, hey, your cybersecurity people are probably really lonely and somewhat introverted in some cases. So take them to lunch and get to know them and ask questions.
Those are great tips. Thank you.
And speaking of questions, I'm going to go in order. Richard Goldberg asks, how dependent is autonomous vehicle technology on 5G? And how will you manage, if it is, how will you manage cyber risk with 5G networks?
So it's really interesting. One of the premises behind the autonomy space is we have a lot of various inputs coming into the vehicle, right? Sensors that are coming in. And while we do have some information that's coming over, cellular networks, none of that is going directly into the autonomous portion of the car. That's a really important thing to think about, because we want to have as few inputs coming into that autonomous portion as possible, because that is a major attack vector, right? People have often asked me, well, how would your autonomous vehicle even work if GPS is down? Well, we don't solely depend on GPS. We have mapping, and we have cameras, and we have sensors that are actually on the vehicle. And so we don't want to have any dependence on any one input that would make the car work. And then also, if anything did fail that was part of something critical, we want to have a graceful degradation, so that if you're in the vehicle and something occurs, it's going to pull over to a safe spot on the side of the road, and another vehicle could come to get you. It's not just going to go berserk and drive off the side of a cliff. So the 5G dependency is not high.
Good. Thank you. The next question, Summer, this is from, I can't tell who.
Sure.
From Yvonne.
Oh, right, sorry. Have you ever gone forward with a decision that you were uncomfortable with? And if so, what were the circumstances and what factors made the company move forward, notwithstanding that risk?
Yes, and in fact, I would say that on a weekly basis, I make some decisions that I'm in my checks and balances with being secure and with making sure that the engineering teams or the business teams can operate. So an example of that would be moving forward, not having an ideal solution for how we're going to store passwords in a certain area. Just a broad example. And how I handle that and why I have to make that decision is because we had a deadline that was coming up. It was not going to impact anything on the actual vehicle itself, but it could have had an exposure to some of our critical intellectual property. So then what I needed to do was allow that solution for the engineers in the short term, start generating a longer term solution, and put in place what we call compensating controls. So if I know that we have a potential weakness in one area, I can then put some additional monitoring and alerting around that functionality. So now on that piece of code or that software base, I now then set up so that anybody who tries to access that, I'm monitoring that, and I get an alert that says, hey, someone tried to access this from Brazil. And that's unusual. Why is someone from Brazil trying to access this area of the code? Let's not allow that. Turn it off, and then we'll see what happens. And so those compensating controls are really how we step in and get comfortable with the things that aren't as secure as we want them to be.
How does your company handle the regulatory end of autonomous vehicles? Do you work with a lobbying group across 50 states, or do you handle that internally?
So this is a really fascinating aspect of the autonomous vehicle space because there is not a lot of regulation currently. We see that there have often been bills that have been put in front of the House that some have made it through the House, some have not made it. We actually have someone in government relations who is in DC who is working across the government relations space with both the government, with others in the industry, and in staying on top of all of the different state laws, right, and what the requirements are. So we have cars operating right now in Florida, Pennsylvania, California, Michigan, and the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. All of those places have different rules and regulations. California has very particular rules about who can drive and who can't and the number of cars. And so we do have teams very particularly that are working that angle. We also are leaning forward because we want to see the regulations and laws that are in place to ensure that all companies are focused on safety and cybersecurity in this space. So there are industry groups as well that we're a part of. One's called PAVE, P-A-V-E. Lots of different groups across industry. I mean, even the FCC, the SEC, when you think about all of the various regulatory groups. And so we have one person and he's building a team to focus on that.
Jessica Costa asks, if one wanted to conduct a cybersecurity audit of a startup company that doesn't yet have a cybersecurity expert in-house, how would you recommend finding a third-party auditor that could help with this?
That's a great question, Jessica. So a question that I would have back would be, what kind of cybersecurity audit are you looking at? So are you looking at their development environment? Are you looking at the controls environments? There's a standard, an international standard called ISO 27001 that has a certification. There's GDPR now when we think about privacy that has cybersecurity related activities. So one thing that I would do is, depending on what type of company it is, find out if there is an industry standard for cybersecurity for that area. So for example, the energy industry has a very particular set of standards that a manufacturing company may or may not have as the same thing. the same regulatory or requirements that are out there. And so finding out that industry, defining what you're auditing inside the company would be important. And then, then you can determine and do searches on what types of companies specialize in that area. There are also some generic frameworks, and I don't mean generic, there are some more broad frameworks like NIST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the government. They have a cybersecurity framework. It's not an audit, but it does have a set of things to look for inside of an organization to say, how mature is it, mature with a lowercase m, but how mature is the cybersecurity program inside of that company. Another place to start, and I don't want to overwhelm you because there are lots of these, but the Department of Homeland Security has something called the Cyber Resilience Review. And if you just Google DHS-CRR, that's a self-assessment that can actually be downloaded that has 163 questions that an organization can answer. And then that will it will actually give you a PDF and beautiful charts that come out to say, these are your capabilities in the cybersecurity area against what we're measuring you. So, how well are you doing vulnerability management, and what are the things that you should be looking for inside of the company? So those aren't particularly audits, they're more assessments, but there are lots of tools out there.
Jessica, you picked the right person to ask this question of. I don't know how well you understood that in advance, but Summer teaches Chief Information Security Officer certification program. She also teaches Chief Risk Officers, a course for Chief Risk Officers. So she's really well versed in this whole subject. I had a question that kind of was raised by you talking about how you never want to use safety as a competitive advantage. Do the companies who are competitors in this field ever coordinate or share information, or would they? If you're not using this as a competitive advantage and you all gain by the safety across the board, then would you share information if you saw or thought or were asked for help with flaws that a company picked up in its own system?
So we're slowly getting there. And there are things called Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, ISACs. The auto industry has an ISAC, and those organizations are meant specifically for what you just said. Sharing threat information, sharing vulnerabilities, sharing solutions to problems. We're now seeing the autonomous vehicle companies starting to come together and be a part of that. We're also seeing other Internet of Things style companies coming together to discuss this. I would say it's in its infancy. However, outside of any sort of intellectual property that we wouldn't want to share, that's something that I think is extremely important in terms of threat information, in terms of vulnerability releases, that we're going to have to get to a level of comfort. The industry that has done this very well is banking and finance. And that sounds sort of silly because we see every day that another banking company, organization was hit with an attack. But the Financial Services ISAC, FS-ISAC, has been in existence for decades now, and they do a very good job of sharing threat information, sharing vulnerabilities, sharing what their fixes are, and it really has made that industry move to the top in terms of cybersecurity capability. I absolutely want to see the AV space mature to that level. To be honest, right now, we're just seeing cybersecurity emerge as a focus. And that's because for the past several years, we just needed software that worked. We needed some sort of software before we could even focus on securing it.
So one thing I was curious about, Summer, it's not a purely legal question, but since you're someone inside this new emerging industry, which appears like it's going to be a giant industry, how is it going to change the concept of things like car ownership? I'm thinking of places like Uber, you know, in theory, what you're working on could make the current version of Uber irrelevant, even though I guess they're in the process of IPOing and getting
Yeah.
lots of more money. If you don't need drivers, then what's the point of Uber? So, but my question really is, um, why, if I'm not driving my car, why do I need to own a car? And which leads me to the question of what's, to the extent you understand, a car company like Ford, what's the benefit of them getting involved in autonomous vehicles when it could potentially go somewhere where, we're not buying a new car every 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. This has ramifications across ownership, across insurance, the
Right.
insurance models that we think about. So the point of an organization like Ford or any of the major OEMs getting involved in this is that they would own the fleets of cars that everyone is using. The goal is to get the driver out of the car because it's more affordable to not have a human being in there. It's also safer. We will get it to a level of safety where we're not depending on someone who's potentially, falling asleep at the wheel, might be incapacitated behind the wheel, all those various things that we see every morning. I drive 26 miles to work one way every day. And the stories, right, that you can tell when you look next to you in traffic and someone is shaving or putting on makeup, or I've seen people reading novels in traffic. And so I think about that and think, oh my gosh, I just wish the software was driving that car. But it does have an impact on ownership. And if we get to a point where we have enough of the fleet available, you are going to just have people who want a car for pleasure driving as the only
Right.
need for owners, right? And
Right.
that's a totally different model. But you would still have the manufacturers pumping the vehicles out to be a part of the fleet that's available.
Right, and it's a huge, isn't it a big change in culture? Because if you look at how cars are sold, they're lifestyle brands, they're almost clothing. They're sold the way clothing is sold. And if we're just sort of dipping into this fleet of autonomous vehicles when we need to get from point A to point B, completely changes the way we're looking at vehicles from a
Yes.
consumer culture perspective. So it's pretty crazy.
And it really gets exciting when you think about also just moving consumer goods, right? And how we can change that model. It's also exciting to think about the fact that, we drive to the beach every year from Pittsburgh. And wouldn't it be great if we all just piled into a car that was a sleeper car and we woke up and all of a sudden we were at the beach, right? So it changes how we transport, what we're going to be doing. When you think about even the design on the inside of a car, it doesn't need to look like it looks now, right? It could literally be a living room space or an office space, and then we have to think about accessibility. So how do you make it so that someone in a wheelchair is able to get into an autonomous vehicle? So there are so many considerations when we think about this. And then again, like the insurance industry, how is that going to work? And how do we cover that side of affordability? But the excitement in all of this is also what I mentioned before in making transportation affordable and accessible to people who don't have that right now. And so that's where you also get into the realm of OEMs being able to produce more cars because they're going to be working in conjunction with public transportation to get someone from either their rural home or their home that's in, a disadvantaged portion of a city. And the bus just doesn't quite get them to where they need to go. And so then they're going to depend on that last mile with an agent.
I'll just point out that I believe Uber has a substantial investment in autonomous vehicles now, and I think all those companies have to, because otherwise, they risk the possibility of being cut out, just as you suggested, Chris. We have one more question, and we're coming up on the end of our time together. That question is from Glenn Thomas, who said, you said the concern was initially just to get working software. Do you now incorporate security into your development lifecycle, and how?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why Argo really put a chief security officer in place and brought me on board. And when you think about security, we used to call it bolting on. right? So software would be built, and then all of a sudden at the end, we would say, oh no, is this secure software? And so then we would have to make some changes to bolt security around the outside. The analogy now is that you're baking security in. It's a part of the fabric of the software that's being built. And that starts way before a piece of code is even built. That starts with some design. So even, or a concept that, you want to build something. What's the concept behind a piece of software that needs to be able to detect water in the road and depth of that water? And then how do we make that secure, and what are the interfaces that are coming into it? So software now is embedded in the life cycle. We call it the secure development life cycle. And I can tell you that it's a really long, deep, detailed process to do that. And right now I have 10 objectives that I need to complete by the end of June. My team and I are working on the top 10 things that we want to add to our development life cycle to improve it. And we will continue to do that and build with it and grow with it so that you can feel confident as members of the public that we have done everything possible to ensure that the software is secure, and that when it does fail or when it is attacked, because it is a matter of when and not if, it's human beings writing this code, and even when it's machines writing code, it's humans who wrote the code for those machines that are writing code. There will be mistakes. There will be attacks. What we want to ensure is that, again, it's graceful degradation, and that all of the passengers in that car and around that car are safe, even when something goes wrong.
I'm going to ask one quick question, and then maybe we're out. We're out of questions in the chat, but it's the idea of perfection. I mean, there isn't anything that's perfect in this world. There are lots and lots of automobile accidents all the time. People don't even blink at them anymore. They just drive around them. And the first time there was a fatality in an autonomous car, that's all people talked about.
Yes.
But there's no way to avoid that. There will be fatalities in every form of transportation. Just mentally and emotionally, how do you deal with that? I mean, is there a way to kind of prepare the public for reality?
So one of the things that I have been studying is how the public responded to moving from horseback to cars in the first place. Because we see very similar reactions to any new type of technology or change. By nature, we're creatures of habit. And so change can be scary. There's, those early adopters and percentage of people that are really excited and want to lean forward. I mean, think about right now where we're talking about space travel being a vacation destination. And most people are saying, no way would I do that. But you have this portion of the population that's like, put me inside of that. I want to be one of the first doing that. And so I'm studying the reactions of how in history we have dealt with when trains became a thing, when cars, and looking at transport and how we got to a point of being able, that people started accepting the new change. So I think it will be a couple of things. One, it will be ensuring that, yes, there will be accidents, but we want to have a significant decrease in the number of accidents. So they will be in the news. There are going to be terrible things that occur, but we want to make sure that, one, when they do occur, there are fewer of them, and two, we learn from them and we can use the software to then build out a fix so that in the future we don't see the same types of accidents. That's a really important thing. And then the second side of that is going to be the convenience and improvements that we see in society from this. And so I think very similarly to how we saw improvements in the Industrial Revolution with what was occurring, we'll see that in the autonomous vehicle space. And we want to make sure that we're thinking about those improvements now and designing for them.
And there will be the lawsuits. we know
right.
that.
So if I have a lot of work, you guys are going to have especially a lot of work.
I love the analogy to the when cars emerged and competed with horses for a period, and even in terminology, people, as you surely read, they used to call cars horseless carriages, and it's even the terminology is even similar, right? We talk about driverless cars, but maybe in 10 years there will just be cars. That's
right. It'll just be cars again.
Exactly.
Well,
right.
And the space The space analogy is good too, because inevitably there was a Challenger disaster and there was a passenger who wasn't an
Right.
astronaut who died.
Yeah.
And it was a shock. How could this happen? But the risk is there for every form of travel.
Right, and the air travel is insanely safe by any logical measure, notwithstanding the Boeing situation. And I think that's largely because we've had autonomous vehicles there long before we've had autonomous vehicles on the land. So,
And I think the Boeing issue is something that's really interesting for our space, because you'll hear my CEO and our teams say over and over that in the AV world, this is not a race to being first. For us personally, this is a race to making the world a challenge, to making the world a better place, not to being first. And so we are very cognizant of the fact that while there's money on the line and there's reputation, when you say 2021, the end of 2021, we're not going to release at the end of 2021 a fleet of driverless vehicles unless it is ready. And that is a guarantee, and that's something we live on a daily basis. So whether we meet that deadline or not, you will know, and you can have confidence that whatever date it is released, it's because we've put it through the amount of tests to feel confident in putting our own families in those cars. There's nothing I would like more than a car to take my son to hockey practice.
definitely. Well, this has been wonderful, Summer. Thank you so much. It's amazing to get a glimpse into your world, because in some ways you're living in the future before the rest of us. So very exciting, wonderful talk. And David, thanks for being such a great co-host for this community. And Summer, we may love to have you back. There's so many interesting things to talk about. So if you're open to it, maybe we'll have you back in a few months and get another update on what you're working on.
Absolutely. And don't forget to give that extra credit to Glenn and Jessica and Score and all the people who were class participants.
Right. They get an A. They get an A+ if next time they show up on the video and ask the question audibly.
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining. And thank you again, Summer. That was great.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks so much.